In the last module, we looked at 3 specific ways that trauma and attachment disturbances might give rise to narcissism. So just as a quick refresher, those included childhood experiences of trauma, abuse, or neglect, parents or caregivers who model and pass on narcissistic tendencies to their children, and finally, environments in which building and maintaining superiority is not only encouraged, but rewarded. Now in this module, we'll get into 3 case studies, and each one will help you to demonstrate how you might approach each of those scenarios I've just described. So first up, Dr. Russell Colts walks you through his work with a client whose narcissism had developed largely out of neglect.
So I worked with a woman, we'll call her Eve, who grew up in a household that was really, really dysfunctional. Her mother was significantly depressed for most of Eve's background, and her father was alcoholic and was one of these people who was occasionally, sometimes physically present, but very rarely psychologically and emotionally present. So Eve was parentified very early on. And, I think many of us will have clients who kind of had to be the grown-up in the home, even well before they were a grown-up. So at age 10, 12, 13, 14, taking care of their siblings, their younger siblings, sometimes taking care of dad when he's passed out and thrown up in the living room, or mom when she won't get out of bed, and, these sorts of experiences. And so he was parentified. And, the way she sort of worked with that, actually, she sort of developed this view of other people as being stupid and undependable and unreliable, because her experiences had taught her that people may tell you that they're going to help you. They may say lots of good things, but they don't follow through. And, the people who are supposed to do stuff don't do it. And you have to do it yourself. And so we can see that for her, it was sort of what you might call a case of pretty extreme avoidant attachment. She didn't really value relationships very much. She hadn't learned that they're helpful. She hadn't learned to feel safe in connection with others, and really had become very self-reliant. And this played out in terms of grandiosity, and also, and her grandiosity, part of it was, I'm smarter. There was this sort of projection that I'm smarter. I know I've got this together. And the other side of it was, and other people don't. Other people are, just kind of stupid. Everyone else are idiots. They're not going to help you. They're not going to be there when you need them. Why even bother? And so for me, as our therapy played out, one of the things that I think was really important is for me to give her a model of another human being who actually cared about her, but who would do so reliably and competently, right? So who had appropriate boundaries, of course, but also, really sort of didn't fit with the stereotypes that she sort of developed about people not being reliable, people being stupid, not being helpful. And so, as we worked, and I sort of helped her kind of go back through her history. And initially it was going back through her history, just talking about how stupid everyone was. She's just telling me this happened and this happened. I was surrounded. I think at some point she said, I've been surrounded by idiots my whole life. Okay, well, tell me about that, right? Tell me about that. And as we go through it, and I'm not challenging anything she's saying, right? I'm not reinforcing the grandiose parts, but if she tells me I'm surrounded by idiots, I didn't say, well, let's start by looking at your mom and having compassion with her, looking at your dad. If I started with that would have just put me in the camp of the other idiots. Now we got there eventually, but, wanted to start initially by letting her unpack her story and to connect with her empathically in a way that she could receive. And initially that took the form of, man, that must have been really frustrating. That must have driven you crazy, right? So the anger part was easy for her to access. And so initially connecting with her about the anger and the frustration and how unfair it was that she'd had to do all this stuff and how disappointing it was. And what happened is, as she gradually sort of got the experience that, hey, this therapist cares about me, this therapist is invested in me, this therapist is sort of listening to me and actually, shows up every week. And, the consistency it was really important there. I had to sort of prove that I didn't fit the mold of the adults she'd grown up with. But as that sort of evolved and she felt safer in the relationship, we were able to get into the hurts kind of behind all that stuff and recognizing actually how terrifying it was at these different points in her development when, she sort of knew she was the one that had to take care of things. And then something would happen that would be terrifying and she didn't know what to do. Right. And so once she was able to sort of dig into that, then we could bridge to having some compassion for that.
So notice, before moving on to his client's more vulnerable parts, Russell first focused on building trust with his client. From there, his next step was to begin building the client's awareness about how her behaviors impacted those around her.
The reason she came into therapy was that it became pretty clear that her marriage was going to fall apart and some of her relationships at her work were strained. And so, and that was in her marriage, the reason that it even gone that far, I think, is that she had coupled with someone with a man who was actually fairly dependent. And so she could kind of bully him and run the show. And that was tricky for her too. And so, as we worked together to unpack that sort of stuff, she was able to begin to have some compassion for how hard it had been for her growing up. And then to begin to have compassion for her husband and, what it might be to be with someone who was kind of running over you all the time and who maybe sort of saw you as stupid and inept, because she sort of had this sort of paradigm. And, there would be times where it would break through. Well, he's not really an idiot. I mean, I wouldn't be with him if he was, actually. And, in those moments where she would break through and talk about him in ways that sort of acknowledged his strengths or shared some genuine affection, which she actually had for him. I think she was in some ways afraid to admit it because that felt a little too real for her, a little too vulnerable. But when she would do that, I again would try to reinforce that, and not through a good client sort of way, a contrived sort of way, but I could tell, there was a moment there when you were talking about your husband where it felt like some real warmth came through, right? Where it felt like, there was some tenderness there. What was that like for you? Did you notice? And sometimes, she'd go blah, da, 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 and kind of explain that away. But other times she'd sort of stay with it a little longer. And so it was about sort of trying to build that out a little bit.
Now, as I know you know, one of the challenges of working with narcissism is that some of the things that your client may say or do can be very off-putting, both to you as the clinician and certainly to the people they themselves are closest to. So how might you help your client begin to do some perspective taking, as Russell calls it, without sparking their defensiveness?
Initially, I would respond by trying to unpack her experience in there, not necessarily by challenging how she would relate to her husband, but what was going on in your mind and what were you feeling there, and to get her to unpack that so that she could see that I wasn't shaming her, right? That I was trying to understand her perspective. And then as our relationship grew and she felt safer with me and she had begun to kind of relax a little bit around some of the grandiosity stuff, to try and do some perspective taking, right? Ouch. Wow. You said that to him? Right. And you notice I use humor very specifically like that with my tone of voice. Now you can only really get away with it when you've got a good therapeutic relationship. But you say, yeah, and I said, you said that to him? Oh my goodness. How do you think he felt hearing that? What do you think that was like for him? and then gradually trying to get her to think about, well, how does she want him to feel when she's around? What role do I want to play in the lives of the people around me? And I think that particularly for people who struggle with narcissism and grandiosity, if you've got a therapeutic relationship in which they're kind of feeling safe, those sorts of questions can be really powerful. Because I think for a lot of them, there is this drive to be good at stuff, right? To not, for some, it may be more of a narrative, but I think there is a sense that I need to be good. I want to be good at stuff. And I don't want to reinforce that when it plays out in sort of, narcissistic ways. But one thing that I think is useful is to harness that, a bit of that sense that, hey, I want to be good at stuff. Well, what if the thing you could be good at is being a good partner for your spouse, or being a good friend? And so when you ask questions like, how do you want people to feel when you're around them? What sort of impact do you want to have on their lives? I think it's sort of a subtle way of enlisting that sort of drive motivation that I want to be good at stuff, in the service of something that's actually going to be helpful, right? And it's hopefully shifting it from how do I be better, how do I be dominant, how do I be on top, to how do I be powerful in this situation, right? In a way that, how can I be powerfully present for the people I care about? How can I be, someone in their lives that helps them feel safe and helps them feel valued and helps them feel okay about themselves? And so those are achievement motivations that I think are wonderful. So I want to reinforce those and shape those.
I so appreciate Russell's strategy of harnessing the motivational aspect of clients' narcissism to spur change. Now that we've looked at an approach to working with narcissism that's rooted in neglect, let's move on to a second case study. In this one, you'll hear Dr. Zindel Siegel's process for helping a client who appeared to have internalized and adopted the narcissistic tendencies of her father.
So this is a woman in her mid-30s. She's a successful IT consultant for a company. She grew up when her parents divorced. And when she was growing up, she spent a lot of time with her dad. Her dad worked in an automotive company, was very successful, but had to move around between plants. So one of her siblings was with the mom. She was with the dad. He was quite self-focused, narcissistic, I would say, in his parenting style with her. And her father is someone who is very kind of corporate, executive, very conscious of his outward appearance. Plays a lot of golf, makes sure that he's fit, and puts a large emphasis on that. She, for example, is also concerned, or I would say preoccupied, with her appearance. She's spent money on Botox and other more minor cosmetic procedures. She's very derogatory of people who are overweight. And she continues to find that the outward appearances are very important to her, including where she lives and where she stays if she goes away, or trying to always create sort of, beautiful exteriors, and trying in a way to use that to fill up a certain internal hollowness. So she is someone who feels now that when she looks back at her parenting, felt that she was never really socialized, and sees herself as being damaged. She's not sure that she can undo the damage, and as a result blames her parents, especially her father, for really, messing her up. And so there's a lot of anger there, as well as a passivity that relates to her ability to change and a pessimism about her future.
So when you're faced with what you might think of as this sort of intergenerational narcissism, where do you begin? According to Zindel, there's typically one very important starting point.
So initially, the important stance in therapy was to validate her sense of the inadequate parenting, the sort of emotional abandonment, the sense to which she wasn't given an opportunity to look after her own needs because she was used, in a sense, in a very minimal way by her father, by her parents, to be a daughter, but not really raised in any effective way to believe in herself. So the validation is really an important first step in this process. And I think the tricky part in therapy becomes, what do you do next? Where do you go from there? And there's a bit of a razor's edge here, or a knife's edge, because the moment you start to suggest, are there ways or things that patient is doing that may contribute to keeping people at a distance or making relationships conflictual, there is the danger that they can see that as you're either blaming them, you're not on their side, or you're giving them an impossible task, which is to look after people when they themselves are the ones that need to be looked after.
So let's zero in on that question Zindel just raised, the question of, where do you go next? I want you to hear how this choice point unfolded with his client.
Part of what happens is that there is a continued hopefulness or a continued recreation of looking for parenting in the wrong places. So continuing interactions with her father are always disappointing. She always feels minimized. She feels diminished because of that, but continues to search and look for her father parenting her differently. And the question of why she continues to search and go back and back for that, I think has been like really a very important nub in therapy itself. She understands that he's limited. She understands that he wasn't really able to parent. She understands she hasn't benefited from that. But why does she continue in her interactions to continue, to look for that or need that or feel that in some ways, if she is damaged, he has the antidote for her. And her ability to shift away from that and to start to see that there may be things that she can do for herself, that there are abilities or moments of being with herself that she can tolerate and see as valuable, is a important first step. And I think the other important step has to do with her starting in a funny kind of way. This is like almost out of left field. The capacity to show kindness to others can sometimes work to break up this monolithic view of herself. And one of the things that she's done is that she's adopted 2 cats. And so her ability to start to look after these animals has developed this additional side of her where she can express these activities and express these intentions, including an emotional attachment to the cats, looking after them, being able to bond and give them identities, post on Facebook or on Instagram about them. It's opened up a dimension that has been lacking, and showing her an additional side of herself that I think has been very helpful. And so it hasn't come from a therapeutic, maybe the therapeutic work laid the groundwork for this, but it hasn't come from like a classic moment of insight. Oh, I need to stop expecting my father, who is inadequate in doing this, to be a father to me. It came from seeing something in herself in terms of looking after animals, being kind, giving herself over to that without resentment. I think that opened up this additional psychological dimension.
By now, we've looked at 2 approaches for working with trauma and attachment disturbances that can give rise to narcissism. So let's get into one more. Specifically, we'll look at how you might treat a client with the kind of narcissism that develops in an environment of overindulgence, ego stroking, and near zero boundaries.
This was a young man who presented in therapy at age 29, but in his teens and until his early 20s. So there was about a 6 to 7 year period where, he's an entertainer, and he was quite famous, right? So he got a lot of attention, all that comes with fame, all that comes with a lot of, people wanting to be around him, people kind of kissing his ring, so to speak, kissing his feet, kissing his ring, people not criticizing him a lot, right? People lifting him up in many, many, many ways. So he spent many of his formative years, from his teens again to his early 20s, in this framework. And the other piece of this case is that he was raised for this, right? He would often say this: he was raised for greatness. And so his parents very much decided early who he was going to be, that he was going to be a star, that he was going to be famous, that he was going to be all of that. And so they really pushed that throughout his life and put him in circumstances in the industry that sometimes were exploitive, right? So there was this sense that that's what I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to be a star. I'm supposed to be seen as amazing. I'm supposed to get a lot of admiration and attention. When that period ended from his teens to early 20s, right, and he stopped getting the attention and stopped, getting opportunities for his craft in his area, the parents became enraged, right? So the parents, blamed him. The parents, criticized him significantly, that there was something he's doing wrong, that he lost his fame, right? So that's kind of the background. So again, he came in with quite a bit of depression, and as we worked with the depression and the depression lifted some, this kind of these narcissistic tendencies, right? So began to emerge a little bit more strongly. And one of the things that I think is important, that I felt strongly in the work with him, was the importance of establishing trust early, as much as possible, right? That he didn't believe, I think, on a real deep level, that anyone had his best interest in mind. So early in treatment, it was really important. What I would say to him sometimes is, I will tell you the truth, right? I will be as truthful with you as I can, whether it's good or bad, right? So if I think something amazing, I'm going to say that about you, right here, and I'm going to notice that. If I think, let's take a step back and reevaluate this, this isn't landing too well, then I'm going to say that as well. So building a sense that my agenda, right, was to be truthful to him, that I did not have another agenda. And that was something we worked on consistently.
Here again, we're reminded how important it can be to develop a level of trust first before you shift over to addressing the narcissism or grandiosity. Take a listen to how Shelley began to ease into this shift.
Part of the work was what is real and what is not. Right? And so, for example, when he would be in one of his more sort of grandiose moments and talking about all the people who loved him and, everybody loves me and, just this sort of disconnection even from his own experience, right? Then I would gently call him on that, right? Gently call him on that. And so continuously pointing out some of the discrepancies and helping to speak to, sort of the real in him, helping him begin to distinguish, what when I say everybody loves me, or when you say everybody loves me, people want to be around me, people follow me around. Is that what's really happening? Do you really believe that everybody loves you? Is that what's going on? And so just a continuous gentle, but some confrontation to point out those discrepancies.
So notice Shelley's approach involved gentle confrontation. At the same time, she helped him develop an important skill.
Another piece of the work was, the growing skill of self-observation and self-awareness. This awareness of his seeking and craving of attention, right? Almost helping him become aware that it had become something he experienced as a need, right? That when it wasn't there, he felt lost. He felt, angry. He felt angry at the world. And even that's a time where the risk for depression got a little stronger. And so his awareness of his craving, his desire for attention and admiration and what that was about. So he got a sense, when he began to get a sense of his own sort of desperation and chasing this attention, that was a real shift, right? Because its function before had been to make him feel powerful, right? I got this attention. People admire me. I'm more talented than anybody. I'm more this, I'm more that. And people are flocking to me and coming to see me, right? When he realized that was controlling him, that was a big shift. That was a big shift. Right? So I feel like there was this movement. The big picture of the treatment, I think, was this movement towards honesty with himself. Okay? Movement towards his own distinguishing between like the hype, what he was buying into, and that voice of truth within himself. And so I think what also happens is then feeling a sense of power in that truth, like feeling good about himself for contacting that truth. So there was another route to feeling good about himself. There was another thing he could say and do to feel good about himself that was not chasing the admiration and the fame and the attention. But when he could puff out his chest about, I'm self-aware about this about myself, right? That was a shift. That was an important shift to change that criteria for what could help him feel good about himself.
Now that you've heard several strategies to help you work with the link between trauma, attachment, and narcissism, I'll ask you to call to mind those 2 or 3 clients Dr. Ruth Basinski talked about in the intro video. And I invite you to take a moment, jot down a note or two about what you just heard. that might help you in your next session with those clients. Once you're done, come meet me in the next module. We'll get into how narcissism plays out in a client's nervous system and how that might impact treatment. I'll see you in Module 5.